Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I will start to see if I can share screen. Yeah, great. Okay, so I will talk about about some of my study that I did on public space that dealt with the main square, Stortorget in Malmö, and specifically I will also touch upon the role of new technology, or more the cell phone in particular, I think, and how that has changed the use of this square. So just to give a quick first view, I did a comparison between how the square was used in the 1970s, following up a study that was done then by Perla Corrosek-Serfati. She was later a professor in Montreal. But I did a copy of that study in 2013. And one of the changes, which you can see here, is that people seem more engaged, both with each other, but also with things, actually. Taking photos more than doubled on the square. And of course, texting and talking on phone did not happen in the 70s. But this is from a photographic study. So 3% of all the people on the photos that I took on the square, which were some 800 photos depicting some 14,000 people, 3% of them were using a cell phone at the time. And another study I did following people rather than photographing them, then it was 12% of the one I started to follow, which sometime during the square started to use their phone. So they have become a very salient feature on this square already in 2013. So when we ask ourselves what are the new places, public spaces of the digital era, some might think of Wi-Fi hotspots or new kinds of street furniture, but I think it's also important to consider how the traditional public spaces of central cities actually are transformed through the use of cell phones without necessarily changing their form. For example, through the possibility of gathering large crowds at short moments. But also, I think that the main change actually is the most drastic change is on an urban level and not on the level of a specific place. And I will come back to that in the end. There are, of course, many ways in which smartphones, if to take this example that I will follow in this talk, change the way we use cities, for example, how we move in cities. So in the kind of traditional, from architectural theory point of view, way of discussing how we move in cities, we have often used this space syntax theory, which has shown that people who are inhabitants of a city tend to use it and move around in it in another way than visitors or tourists. But these, of course, can change, because through your cell phone, you can find the map immediately and you can start moving more like an inhabitant rather than following the large streets where the tourist things have tended to locate themselves. So I'm just going to start here by a small, because I often take a territorial perspective, what kind of territory is produced when we use our phone. And I use this list from Talia Hatuka and Eran Koch from their article in 2016, where they notice how the cell phone contributes to a kind of simultaneous participation in multiple spheres of interaction. So it adds layer in a sense, but it also transforms our use, since it modifies our interaction rituals. So we start behaving in different ways when we interact with other people. And they also notice the detachment and a less sensitivity to physical space and interactions, and the kind of blurring of definitions between private and public. And for me, I'm interested in this, how not looking at smartphones as Lee maybe does from the technology, from within the technology, or from the point of view of these new devices, but more from the point of view of the square or from the urban space and how this actor comes in and transforms an already existing environment in different ways. And just to give a first example of how new technology actually might have large-scale effects, I take a low-tech example of the introduction of the technology of the tea bag, which Geren Kravets wrote a very interesting essay on, the introduction of tea bags in Turkey and how it actually altered urban space use. Because with the tea bag came the possibility to choose between different varieties of tea, and also it meant that the old samovar was no longer the only drinking alternative. So it opened up a possibility for multiple choices of tea, and then also the choices of other drinks as well. So the kind of ubiquitous, constantly available samovar was slowly replaced by specific tea drinking places and specific tea drinking occasions, producing a kind of fracturing and splitting of the tea drinking practice. So this is a quote from them. And tea drinking moves from any time to designated times that are consistent with the collective rhythms of leisure and work times. And they also note how this subsequently produces specific places in the city, specific tea stalls, cafes, specific breaks in the work hours and so on for drinking tea. And this change, of course, is not just because of the tea bag, but it's a transformation of public space which draws its power from objects of different scales. I mean, from tea producers, workplaces and the change of workplaces, but also from the tea bag as a small new technology, of course. And the interesting thing here, I think, is that different kinds of actors, from workplace regulations to the way in which you prepare your tea, to coffee shops and tea stalls, these different scales align to produce and form these new kinds of social spatial patterns. So we can take other technologies like the washing machine or indeed the smartphone, and we might see that these two new technologies in a way do the opposite to the tea bag. Like with affordable washing machines in Sweden, for example, washing moved from laundry days and laundry tvättstugor, collective laundry spaces, into the apartment, fragmenting moments of loading and unloading washing, and thus disrupting the kind of collective rhythms around washing. And in a similar way, you could say smartphones make informational access and social contact possible. So you have access to friends in a ubiquitous way, but you also, in a way, break free from these collective social rhythms in that sense. So it's also kind of fragmenting practice that align with changes on other scales, which I think we can see that I will hopefully try to show you now in this, telling you about this investigation that I did on the square in Malmö. So this is a very old square from 1520 something, used to be a market square. And I found out that Korosek did a very thorough study in 1978. And that was the very same month that they opened up the pedestrian street. So it was the first early days of pedestrianization in a newly, in the kind of the early days of the consumer society. And I did an exactly the same kind of investigation 35 years later. And the interesting thing for me was that nothing had changed in terms of urban design. So it's exactly the same kind of benches. There were two benches that had moved a little. There was one kiosk who had been replaced by another kiosk. Otherwise, everything was the same. So following their study, I did observation studies, following some 400 people around the square. I did photographic studies, photographing one photo every 5 minutes, 2 hours a day during 1 week, capturing about, as I said, 14,000 people on these these pictures. So the first thing we can say about the change, we start with a kind of large-scale change of the square. We can see the market, which had been there for hundreds of years, was forbidden in 1957 due to the introduction of cars and parking places. So there was a battle of space, you could say, around the 50s, 60s. Then in the 70s, 78, the new pedestrian precinct come, and we could see the start of kind of shopping territory, an increasing pedestrianization of the inner city, changing the inner city from a mixed city to kind of retail place. The table shows a study of how this square has been reported of in the newspaper, the local newspaper. And we see that from mentioning more official activities, political activities, now the reporting is about collective celebrations, big cultural events, the new city festival that started in 1985, this kind of different things drawing tourists actually. So the square has increasingly, maybe as Mekkonen suggested, it's about making tourists happy rather than local inhabitants, and I will come back to that. We can also see an increased number of restaurants and less shops. And people move around more lonely now than they used to. So in the 70s, we could see large clusters walking around. 12% of the people were in groups of 3 or more. And just looking at this table, you can see that the number of people walking alone has increased, whereas people in pairs or in groups of 3 or more have decreased quite a lot. It's also gone from being a square very dominated, or a little bit dominated by men, to being a bit more equal in terms of gender division. This has to do that the huge wharfs, large working places for blue-collar workers, has been changed into a university and to office and white-collar workers. This is not seen in the city center, but has to do with the large urban changes in the neighborhoods next, actually, to the city center. Looking at what people do, this is a square that you just pass by in a normal day. It's on the way to the railway station or on the way to the pedestrian precinct. But still, if we compare with the 70s, you see that the pace and the movement of the square seems to have increased, as only half as many sit down on the square now as in the 70s. And since it's the same number of benches, the same affordances are there, this is something that has not to do with urban design, but something else. And when people do take a break on the square, they do it standing up, pausing. So the number of people pausing has doubled. This means that fewer people take breaks, but when they do it standing up, and a lot shorter breaks. I could also see some 200 people, even though I did the study when there were no events, I could see 200 people on the pictures working with setting up things that had to do with upcoming events. So the picture on the top here is a countdown screen for the Eurovision Song Contest, which were happening in Malmö later the same year that I studied this square. So just to give you a kind of feeling of this change in temporality and pace, you can look at the bottom line of this table, and you see that pausing had increased, and pausing was in the meantime of these 280 situations that I clocked, they are less than 2 minutes. And if you're pausing taking pictures with your cell phone, it's even shorter. And I had 96 situations of these 280 that involved people taking pictures, which was one of the activities that increased. Whereas sitting down, which people did more in the 70s, they seem to stay much longer, at least 10 times as long. Another change on the square was the age groups. So In the 70s, there was a more mix of different age groups, whereas during the 2010s were much younger population. And if you look at the table, you can see that even though, of course, Malmö is a city that actually has the young population has increased over these 30 years. So, but this increase is just 7%, or from 56 to 63, which makes a 22% increase, whereas on the square, there's almost 50% more younger people today. So the young population is really starting to dominate the square, whereas the old population is basically not seen there anymore. What are the reasons for this? I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and we can discuss them later as well. It has to do with large-scale changes, like the introduction or the starting of building up of this pedestrian precinct. It has to do with urban changes, factories turning into offices, but it also has to do with the things that we carry around. So remarkably, a lot of things that people carry around today that they didn't seem to do in the 70s. And when people are taking a break, they're not just taking a break, but they're often doing it a secondary activity connected to it. So if they take a pause, they do it in order to talk to someone, in order to take a picture, in order to eat something. And we also see more food, takeaway coffee, and these kinds of things. And this, of course, affect how we use public space. So it takes time it takes a certain duration to drink a cup of coffee. So the duration you stay on a place is not up to you. It's up to you and the coffee cup together, in a sense. You cannot spend 2 hours drinking a coffee, but if you sit down to drink a coffee, it takes a certain amount of time. So that would be part of co-producing the amount of time that you actually stay in public space. And the reason for people to pause much more is, I guess, that texting and taking a phone call is much more common today, and you don't need to sit down to do that, but it's easier to just stand up and text and then move on. It's also the fact that in the 70s, when people met up with a friend, you have to say, okay, we meet at that hour at that bench, and then you just have to wait for your friend. Whereas now, if you come 5 minutes late, you just phone your friend and they say, I went on to this store, can you move on, and so on. So in the pictures from the 70s, you see an example here. You see a lot of people just sitting on benches, seemingly doing nothing, but probably waiting for someone or looking at other people and so on. So this is also why people sat down more and perhaps stayed longer in that square. And for me, as an architect and interested in urban design, it was interesting to note that the kind of favorite spots on the square have changed during this time. So in the 70s, the most popular places was the benches in front of the town hall to sit down and wait. But now people sit down much more around the statue on the steps, because you have a better way of seeing people, but also because you can put your food and your takeaway coffee and your laptop on the flat surface in a way that you cannot put them on a bench, which has this kind of not a flat surface, but is more adjusted for you to sit properly, but does not take your things into consideration. In a similar way, this fountain was also became the most popular place for standing up and pausing, taking photos, and so on. So my interest here is actually how, in the situation, changes of different scales come together. So the changes of how this square is used, it's partly because of the cell phone and how that the use of the cell phone is suddenly afforded by other places on the square than what affords you to wait for a friend or sit read a book, which was more common in the 70s. But it's also how its position in relation to industrial areas have changed, and it's now connected to office areas. And it's about how this square has become the entrance to a large retail area, which means that there's a lot of circulating shoppers, younger population, more tourists, and more people coming from outside the city to visit it just for a shopping tour. And I think an interesting thing for me here is actually the notion of scale. There is a definition that scale is the different level of complexity of the components internally arranged to construct a whole. And as architects, we of course use different scales for different problems, but I think all problems are multi-scale problems actually. And we should not forget that scales are produced. So I mean, already with Haussmann and the production of the Esplanade system in the boulevards in Paris, we saw how, we can take this quote, the street become a mineral realm because the street were set in stone, whereas the indoor spaces were set in wood. So the street become a mineral realm whose hard and yielding durability was perceptibly distinct from the more delicate vegetal ground of the home. Different scales are produced, scales of different times and scales of different spaces, through designs and through our use of them. And trying to understand the transformation of this square, I found out that actors of very different scales co-worked somehow. So we had the office areas, the event square, fast food restaurants, the takeaway coffee, the laptops, the smartphones, and the flat surfaces, all these different materialities of different scales coming together to change the space. So this is my last slide, and I will try to kind of sum up. I think my argument is that an important task for us is to understand how different scales are aligned, and through this alignment produce effects and changes in the way in which our cities are used. So this means that even the smallest gadget, as the smartphone or the tea bag, can have very large scale consequences, but they always co-act with other changes, and they play into the hands of other kinds of changes. So in this case, for example, the change from an industrial city to a consumer city, and the temporal restructuring of everyday life, which depended on this, but which also have been driven by these new technologies. And what I want to come to actually is, at the same time as we see more and more connected place at this main square, they have Wi-Fi, they have a lot of middle-class people going around with access to new technology and takeaway coffee. We can also see kind of deepening inequality, and this was noted actually already by Korosek-Serfati in the 1982s, that there are certain groups that are absent from the squares. And I would claim that today this is even more clear, that what we see is a young population rather than a mixed population. What we see are tourists and people coming from outside rather than people living in the area, because people don't live in this area anymore to the same extent that they did in the 70s. And we see shoppers and we do not see older people. From another study made by Carina Listerborn and Johanna Sixtensson, they interviewed the increasing people from the increasing Muslim population in Malmö, especially women wearing veil. And it was very clear from these interviews that they never entered into this square, or actually didn't want to go north of Triangeln, most of them, and into the pedestrian precinct at all. So it's very clear that certain groups are not actually, this is the kind of the most important symbolical space of the city. It's not accessible to all groups. And also, as we have seen, this square has been more and more developed into a square of events, kind of specialization of public space that we see going on during these 30 years. The square just next to it, Lilla Torg, has been transformed into a kind of food court for people taking a beer after their work. This has been transformed, the main square, into the big square of events, and I can talk more about that because the municipal plans is very much about transforming this square even further into a specialist kind of urban type kind of event square. And this, I mean, is part of a development into a city a la carte, which is a bit tragic in the sense that the local, it goes hand in hand with the crisis of the neighborhood units in Sweden, the local areas and the local public spaces which are declining and struggling, meaning that we have more and more things to, more and more offers in the city, but they are further and further away. And I think the smartphone helps us to access these different offers in the city a la carte. But since all the kinds of offers are spread over a region rather than over a neighborhood, it can be accessed most easily for those by resources. So this city a la carte on the region level rather than as the modernists would have it on the neighborhood unit level is also creating a problem of segregation and inequalities in terms of access to the goods of the city or the urban landscape. And I think I stop there. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that, Mattias. I know for certain now that I will not be able to walk across Stora Torg in Malmö without thinking of this now. And of course, this transformation that you talk about from like towards kind of like an event and entertainment space is of course something that we can see in a lot of Swedish cities and internationally as well, right? And it sort of in a way connects back to the very first presentation we had today about sort of these museums and their role in art festivals in Hobart. Anyway, do we have any questions for Mattias? Magnus?
Thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Mattias, for a very nice presentation. I actually have two small comments. And one of them is that the infrastructure, and then I'm thinking about the communication infrastructure, and what does the Wi-Fi, the free Wi-Fi spots, what kind of difference does it make? Because usually you can see, not least the gig workers and the bike couriers are sort of hanging around where they can get free access to the internet. So in that sense, it could mean a more mixed groups of people. And the other thing I was thinking of was, once I heard, I think it was Nina Glick-Schiller talking about transnational studies and how that it was a good idea to avoid the capitals, because capitals are seldom very interesting from a transnational perspective. You should go for the second or the third city in a country, because there it's more mundane, it's less representative. And in that sense, you can also say that Stortorget is sort of the representative thing of Malmö, that there are other market squares that maybe have been more dynamic since the 1970s. I don't know, and it's a speculation, but I just wonder if you have any kind of comments to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Stortorget is going towards becoming a kind of more boring square than it used to be. It never used to be very fun, actually, because it was always, I mean, at least since the 50s, been quite a boring square and representative square. And I think there's a lot of other places in Malmö. So this is not to say that Malmö has bad public spaces, but that this public space has become maybe more and more exclusive, and that this temporary obsession with the temporary is starting to leave permanent marks, in a sense, of the square. So I think it would be interesting to follow this up with synchronic studies of other squares to see how they thrive maybe on the changes on Stortorget. and to actually study the ecology of public spaces in a city. I don't think that has been done, but I think that would be very interesting, an important thing to do sometime in the future, to see this ecology of public space. When it comes to free Wi-Fi, and so I mean, this study was made 2013, and I don't know if there was, maybe the free Wi-Fi was inside the cafes or something like that. But maybe that's also what attracted the younger population that had increased. So, but yeah, I mean, I didn't see anything around that actually in my study, but of course that could be one way of in some place attracting a new population depending on the place.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one quick question from Karin before we have a break. Karin.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Mattias. Very interesting presentation. I was just curious because I take it that you did some kind of rhythm analysis also of city life, and potentially then also saw how the fluctuation of people changed with the hour of the day, because I figure that you could see different populations during different times of the day, perhaps. Were there any differences of that kind that you would like to talk to?
Yeah, I did. I've done rhythm analysis of other places and of the city center as a whole more. I don't remember now. I mean, one change that I could see was that in the everyday, the rhythms were very different during weekends. So depending on where the stores were open and so on. So certain places like Lilla Torg became very important during Sundays, or I don't remember, Sundays or Saturdays, whereas Stortorget was more important during weekdays. So there was kind of a changing of places over time. Definitely that is part of it. But I think also wrote an article where I looked at how the kind of synchronization of commercial interests in the city center, and that development over these decades certainly plays a part in the change of this square, I would say. Since it's more restaurants on the square and the shops have disappeared, so when people go shopping, they hang out more in the pedestrian streets. And then when they go to eat lunch or have a beer, they end up on the squares. This kind of specialization is something that has crystallized in Malmö over these decades. It didn't used to be like that, but for some reason, there is the idea that you need to take your beer on a square and you need to shop on the street. And that has been more clear cut, I think, in the development of the inner city spaces, for example.